Welcome to Talk Satellite.
Hey, Kevin. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Please, can you provide us background on how you've been covering the Chinese market and give a broader landscape on what's happening in that field?
Sure thing. So I'm the managing director of Orbital Gateway Consulting, a Hong Kong company through which I've been covering the Chinese commercial space sector for almost 10 years now, so almost since the very beginning back in 2014. And through that, I've covered their large non-geostationary communication constellations, so the Chinese response to Starlink, and then also launch, remote sensing, TT&C, other ground systems, and then the broader policy and economics and financing and all these different things that comprise the Chinese commercial space sector. And today, talking primarily about the aforementioned Chinese response to Starlink, these large non-geo constellations. I think to set a little bit of the landscape, there's currently two major constellations that are being deployed. So there's the Guowang, or National Network constellation, being developed by China SatNet, or China Satellite Networks Limited. And then there's the Thousand Sails constellation that's being developed by SpaceSail. And just to keep this brief, these two constellations are doing more or less functionally the same thing, but in very different ways and with very different target markets. So Guowang and SatNet is a fully state-owned enterprise, so owned by the national government. It's largely focused on the Chinese domestic market for the time being. And when we look at the entities with whom SatNet has cooperated, they have a JV with China Mobile and Norinco, for example, and Norinco being the big Chinese military materiel provider. It's pretty clear that China SatNet is really quite a domestic and state-owned enterprise focused constellation. Thousand Sails, on the other hand, operated by SpaceSail, is somewhat more commercial and also quite a lot more international. So somewhat more commercial, meaning, they're bankrolled by the Shanghai municipal government and by the Chinese Academy of Sciences. And it's really kind of a Shanghai clique type of a project. So still kind of state-owned, but a bit more flexible with the way they're able to do things. And then when we look at their international presence, they've signed MOUs already in Malaysia, in Brazil, in Thailand, and then they recently announced some actual testing that they're doing in Kazakhstan. So quite a lot going on with SpaceSail internationally. And just a quick final point about the respective scale of these two constellations. So they both talked about launching more than 10,000 satellites. And at the moment, SatNet has launched about 100 and SpaceSail has launched 90. And SatNet has really been ascendant just these last few weeks. They've done, 6 launches in the last 5 weeks or something like that. So a really impressive ramp up by SatNet.
So SpaceSail constellation, I think, is the one receiving a great deal of attention in the market. Can you give more detail on how it's playing out in terms of rollout and take-up, from the market itself?
Sure. So I think definitely if we're talking about the global SATCOM market, SpaceSail is going to be the more near-term, is going to have a more near-term impact. Again, they're quite international in their focus. And in the markets that they've already signed MOUs, and if we read some of the language of those MOUs, they're targeting markets where in some cases, the word on the street is that Starlink has been, maybe not the best long-term partner with some of their distributors in these markets. So to take an example, if we look at Malaysia, Starlink signed a reseller agreement with Miasat a few years ago now. I think they were the first Starlink reseller in Malaysia. And then Starlink went and signed similar reseller agreements with more than 10 or 10-ish, let's say, Malaysian service providers. And if I were Miasat, that would have probably been a little bit disconcerting. And so it should come as no surprise that SpaceSail has signed their MOU with Miasat in Malaysia. And when we hear what SpaceSail says publicly, when we look at their press releases and their conference presentations, they talk about wanting to be more of a partner to some of these international companies. They talk about wanting to be more of like a sort of telco backbone layer of infrastructure rather than always going direct to the end user and having to, really squeeze every bit of margin that they can out of the market, which to some extent seems to be the modus operandi of Starlink in some of these markets. So I think high level, we could say, SpaceSail is coming into these international markets with a bit more of a collaborative approach, and maybe to a certain extent, without wanting to look too much into it, it reflects kind of the broader Chinese approach of being less concerned about immediate profits and being more concerned about winning market share and sort of winning goodwill from certain foreign partners. And so, similar to what we would see in electric vehicles, where China is coming into these markets and selling at pretty cutthroat costs, even though they could probably be selling at somewhat higher costs, with the logic probably being this is a fast-growing industry and market share is as important, if not more important, than short-term profits.
There's much said on the multi-orbit facility. Are Chinese also chasing this initiative?
I would say yes and no. I mean, definitely in China there's China Satcom that has their GEO satellite constellation, and China Satcom has been deploying progressively larger GEO high throughput satellites. So they're currently the biggest satellite is 100 gigabits per second, and next year or possibly in 2027 they plan to have a 300 gigabit per second satellite. There's at least one fairly credible MEO constellation, the Smart Skynet. They've launched 2 MEO satellites, and they have plans for something like 12 in their first generation. So basically a sort of Chinese version of the original O3B, let's say. And then again, there's these LEO constellations. Now, the challenge in a Chinese context is that some of these companies like China Satcom or China Satnet, who I mentioned earlier, are fully state-owned. And in the case of Satcom and Satnet, they're owned by the same entity at the end of the day, which is the central government. But China Satcom is owned by CASC, and then some of their shares are publicly traded. And it's not that simple for them to cooperate necessarily with a China Satnet type of an organization. And likewise, it's not really that simple for, let's say, SpaceSail to cooperate with China Satcom or to cooperate with Smart Skynet. And so, there's definitely the infrastructure is being deployed across multiple orbits. And on the ground segment side of things, there are a limited number of manufacturers that are talking about, specifically multi-orbit terminals. But I think it's not something that we would expect to see in the near term, except probably somewhere far behind the scenes. There's some kind of MilSatcom type of applications that are being developed using these different constellations in a way that's very national security focused, and so they can cut through a lot of the red tape that would otherwise be present. But I think near term, I wouldn't expect very much in terms of multi-orbit.
Where would you say the Chinese are having the most success on the international arena?
Typically, in terms of geographies, the usual suspect places, so like Belt and Road, Global South, there's a lot of activity in Southeast Asia. There's quite a lot of activity in the Middle East, and then less, but still a fair bit of activity in Latin America and also Central Asia to a certain extent. And then I think in terms of let's say, applications that are being offered, SpaceSail has been, other than the traditional, say, China Satcom and APT satellite GEO comms guys who have been going international for a very long time, SpaceSail has been the first, or at least the most successful, communications or satellite communications offering going abroad. Others like Galaxy Space, they've had some MOUs and some tests in some Southeast Asian countries, but SpaceSail has been the big one there. In terms of other applications, remote sensing has been rather more intriguing in some ways. You've seen this Oman Lens, which is, as the name would imply, it's an Omani project, and it's cooperating with Starvision, which is a Chinese company that does remote sensing and sort of AI plus satellite and sort of optimized data processing on board satellites, this type of thing. And they have this whole constellation concept, the Oriental Space Eye, OSE. I was at a conference earlier this year in Cairo, this New Space Africa conference, and Starvision and Oman Lens were sharing a booth, and they talked about this OSE constellation. And, it was very much a kind of Sino-Middle Eastern project to some extent. That's a real project. They have a few satellites on orbit, and they have more than just marketing brochures and pamphlets, although they do have an ample number of pamphlets. But I think remote sensing is another area that has seen, if anything, more tangible results up until now than some of these newer SATCOM projects. And then I think the last thing I would mention is Chinese launch service providers are starting to offer starting to launch foreign payloads. So just a few days ago, we saw on a CAS Space rocket, which CAS Space, one of these new commercial launch companies, they launched, among several Chinese satellites, they launched a couple of Mexican satellites. So we're starting to see more foreign payloads launched on Chinese satellites. Still a relatively small number, like a handful per year, but more than would have been the case a handful of years ago, let's say.
And how does the new space investment work to provide innovation?
Yeah, so in a Chinese context, I think it works a little bit differently where the national government will proclaim that some new space technology is important, like satellite internet, let's say. And then a lot of provinces and cities will provide sort of indirect support for companies doing satellite internet or for companies doing launch, let's say, that type of thing. And when I say indirect support, it would be things like free land or free factory space or subsidies of a few hundred US dollars per month per graduate that a company hires in that city or province. Or a rebate if a company builds a satellite in a given city and they launch that satellite, maybe the city government gives them 25,000 US dollars, let's say, as a rebate for launching the satellite. It's kind of creating a bit of a sandbox mode for these companies where their costs are all subsidized and they're given a fair bit of leeway to just kind of experiment with different technologies. And I would contrast this with the U.S., where the government support is a little bit more on the demand side of things. So it's like NASA or the DoD or whomever says, we have a contract or a tender here, and we want this specific technology or capability. And if you can give us this capability, we will buy that capability from you. And that's how they support commercial space, broadly speaking. And again, in China, there's not as much of that demand side support. So the government is not typically giving as many contracts to commercial companies, but rather they're saying, we will subsidize all of your costs and then let you guys experiment and let 1,000 flowers bloom, if I can use the old phrase there. So I think it's, in short, the difference would be that in China, you have a lot of supply side support, whereas in the US, you have a lot of demand side support. And I think that it leads to, on the Chinese side, a bit more tinkering, a bit more, engineers just throwing things at the wall and seeing what sticks. And, what I've come to conclude recently is if there are a lot of new applications that can be unlocked by lower launch costs, or there's a real new space economy that can be found, probably China has, certainly they have more engineers just throwing things at the wall and seeing what sticks. And that could mean that they're more likely to figure out some of these new use cases. On the other hand, if this new space thing is kind of a bubble, and if there's only broadband from space and a few other usual suspect applications, then you're going to have a lot of satellite factories and rocket factories and other factories in China that are not really needed, because at the end of the day, they build dozens of rocket factories, for example, and unless there's a real new space economy to be had out there that many times bigger than the current one, you don't need dozens and dozens of rocket factories or satellite factories and so on. So different systems and different ways of supporting innovation, I would say.
Last but not least, geopolitics.
Yeah. Geopolitics is the ever-present elephant in the relatively small room. So what's there to say about geopolitics? I mean, I think, as I mentioned earlier, I see China using space, among other things, to try to win market share and also to try to win, let's say, geopolitical clout, or at a minimum, win friends and influence people along the Belt and Road and elsewhere. I think, one interesting example of geopolitics having a negative impact on China's space ambitions would have been, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where, in 2019, to great fanfare, China and Russia announced this International Lunar Research Station, this long-term lunar project. And at the time, they were very much hoping to have European Union countries be members and have this be like a real alternative to Artemis for established spacefaring nations. And again, very much a Sino-Russian thing at the beginning. It was announced in Chinese and in Russian. And then once the war in Ukraine started, and also, China stuck by Russia in this ILRS project, it became impossible for any of the European Union countries to join this ILRS project. And so now you have the ILRS, and it's still moving along kind of as planned. And it's signed on maybe 15, 20 different countries. Some of these countries are bigger than others. None of them are traditional spacefaring countries. And so it's an example, I guess, or it's an indication of what can happen when geopolitics rears its ugly head in the space domain.
Blaine, thank you very much for coming along today. Very insightful. It's always great to have a chat with you.
Well, thanks for the invite, Kevin. It was good catching up.